वासुदेवाय ओम नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय नारायणं नमस्कृत्य नरं चैव नरोत्तमं देवीं सरस्वतीं व्यासं ततो जयमुदीरयेत् श्रीमतां स्वकथा कृष्ण पुण्य श्रवण कीर्तन हृदयन्तो हि अभद्राणि विदुनोति शुभिः सतां नष्टप्रायेषु अभद्रेषु नित्यं भागवत सेवया भगवते उत्तम श्लोके भक्तिर्भवति नैष्टिकी. So I'm doing a little overview of chapter 29, Canto 4, chapter 29. So chapter 29 talks about the discussion between Narad Muni and King Prachina Barhi. When King Prachina Barhi said to Narad Muni that he could not understand the allegorical story that Narad Muni talked about. He had difficult time to understand the story. So the discussion is focused on the principles of spirituality and liberation from the cycle of birth and death. Narad Muni explained to King Prachina Barhi that the ultimate goal of human life is to perform one's duties without attachment, stressing the importance of dharma and spiritual practices like devotional service to the Supreme Godhead Lord Krishna. Narad Muni also explained the constitutional position of the Supreme Personality of Godhead and the living entity, while directing the king towards spiritual enlightenment. Narad Muni emphasized the importance of performing one's duties without attachment, which means that one should focus on fulfilling their responsibilities without being motivated by personal desires or expectations. The chapter explains that living entity, which is the enjoyer, is Puranjana, and due to propensity to enjoy the modes of material nature to the fullest, the living entity prefers to accept the human body with its 9 gates, 2 legs and 2 hands. The 9 gates are sense organs. The living entity takes up material intelligence, which is ignorance, and with this type of material consciousness of I and mine, the living entity starts to enjoy and suffer through his senses, which include mind. And thus, living entity gets entrapped. The queen of Puranjana is described as intelligence, which is contaminated due to material modes of nature. The living entity acts under the influence of contaminated intelligence. What was referred as chariot in the previous chapter is actually the body of living entity with senses which are referred as horses that pull the chariot. These horses run without any strings attached. In fact, these horses run with no real progress. The 11 senses of the living entity are referred as soldiers. Being deeply engrossed in sense enjoyment, the living entity seated on the chariot hankers to fulfill its false material desires and thus runs after sense enjoyment life after life. The living entity attains a different body life after life as a result of influence of fruitive activities for sense enjoyment. If one wants to make real progress and get out from the cycle of transmigration to different types of bodies, one has to take shelter of lotus feet of Lord Krishna through unalloyed devotional service. The living entity with material body is destined to suffer the miseries of material life, which includes old age, disease, and ultimate death. This chapter explains that knowing the basic misery of material existence, one should be induced to get out of the material clutches and return home back to Godhead. Actually, the living entity is not at all happy in this material body. Because of the body, he suffers thirst and hunger and is influenced by mind, by words, by anger, by the belly, by the genitals, and so on. Manifold miseries encircle the transcendental living entity simply because he desires to satisfy his senses in this material world. If he simply withdraws from activities of sense gratification and applies his senses in the service of the Lord, all the problems of material existence will immediately diminish. And with the advancement of Krishna consciousness, he will be freed from all tribulation, and after giving up the body, will return home back to Godhead. The chapter also talks about the living entity wandering in different species of life according to destiny and desire. The ultimate solution to all material life problems is awakening to Krishna consciousness. Significance of a spiritual master is emphasized, and it is recommended to surrender to Supreme Personality of Godhead through his representative, who is the bona fide spiritual master. Material existence is the result of fruitive activities which are the cause of repeated birth and death. One can stop this process by engaging oneself in the service of Lord Krishna. Simply by hearing the glories of the Lord, one is elevated to the transcendental position. This chapter 29 again and again emphasizes the cultivation of devotional service to the Supreme Lord. Fruitive activities are strongly criticized. The chapter states that after many births, we have attained this human form. Therefore, before death comes, we should engage ourselves in the transcendental loving service of the Lord. That is the fulfillment of human life. The chapter shows that after listening to Narad Muni's instructions and suggestion, King Prachina Barhi is convinced and agrees to Narad Muni's narrative. The king addresses to Narad Muni by saying, "My dear Brahman, there are contradictions between your instructions and those of my spiritual teachers who engage me in fruitive activities. I now can understand the distinction between devotional service, knowledge, and renunciation. I had some doubts about them, but you have now very kindly dissipated all the doubts. I can now understand how even the great sages are bewildered by the real purpose of life. Of course, there is no question of sense gratification. The chapter talks about how the gross body of living entity is forced to act by the subtle body, which consists of mind, intelligence, and ego. After leaving the current body, the living entity acts in another body through the activities of his mind and intelligence. The living entity thus enjoys the results of the actions of his past life. This subject is discussed in enough detail through a number of texts in the later part of the chapter. The chapter also talks about the transmigration of soul, which happens by virtue of the processes of subtle body, causing the living entity to develop and give up gross bodies. As long as living entity desires to enjoy the sense gratification, he creates material activities, and while enjoying the senses, he creates another series of material activities. In this way, he gets entrapped as a conditioned soul. The chapter finally shows that Narad Muni, after explaining to King Prachina Barhi the constitutional position of Supreme Lord and the living entity, invited King Prachina Barhi, and after that Narad Muni left for Siddhaloka. King Prachina Barhi later left home and went off to perform austerities in holy place called Kapilashram. Finally, king attained liberation from material designations. He stayed engaged in devotional service of the Lord and attained a highly elevated spiritual position. I'll close here. Thank you, devotees, and I'm sorry for any shortcomings. Please forgive me for any shortcomings.